A girl sits behind the wheel of a parked car in the middle of the night, headlights washing over a dying kangaroo on the side of the road. She knows what the right thing to do is. She just can't bring herself to do it. That's the quiet horror at the heart of Talk to Me, long before anyone grabs the embalmed hand or lets a ghost slip inside them. On the surface, this is a brutal, inventive, supernatural horror movie about a group of Australian teenagers who discover a party game that lets them invite the dead into their bodies for 90 seconds at a time. But underneath the jump scares and viral clips, it's a story about grief, addiction, and what happens when you hand your pain over to people and forces that don't really care if you make it out alive. The setup is deceptively simple. Mia is a 17-year-old still reeling from her mother's death, orbiting around her best friend Jade's family because it feels more like home than her own house does. When she sees a video of classmates clutching a pale ceramic hand and convulsing as if something has crawled inside their skin, she doesn't read it as danger. She reads it as escape, connection, the possibility of touching something beyond the numbness she's stuck in. That's where the world of Talk to Me really begins, not in some ancient cursed object lore dump, but in a painfully recognizable teen ecosystem of group chats, house parties, and Instagram stories where everything, fear, pain, even possession, becomes content. The game is brutally straightforward. You sit in a chair, they strap you in, you grab the hand and say, "Talk to me." And if you're unlucky enough to see a corpse sitting in front of you, you invite it in. Phones are already recording before the spirit even arrives, because the point isn't just the experience, it's the performance, the proof that you were brave enough, crazy enough, reckless enough to do it. What makes this world feel so unsettling is how normal it all looks. These aren't gothic mansions or remote cabins. They're messy suburban houses, bright bathrooms, and bedrooms littered with phones and discarded clothes. The horror doesn't burst in from outside. It seeps out of the way these kids talk, film, and dare each other to go further. The way they treat a brush with the supernatural, the same way they treat a trending TikTok challenge. Mia steps into this ritual carrying more than just curiosity. She's grieving, she's lonely, and she's quietly furious at a world that moved on without her, which makes her the perfect person to fall in love with the feeling of being taken over. Because for 90 seconds, something else is in control. When the spirits start talking back in a voice that sounds a little too much like the mother she lost, that's when the party trick turns into something much darker, and the line between comfort and corruption basically disappears. So in this essay, we're going to sit with that discomfort. We'll walk through how Talk to Me builds its world out of real teenage behavior, why the possession sequences feel less like exorcism scenes and more like drug binges, and how a simple kangaroo on a highway quietly foreshadows the film's final, devastating choice. Because once you understand the emotional logic of this world, how grief makes Mia vulnerable, how social media turns horror into spectacle, how addiction wraps itself in the language of connection, the ending stops feeling like a twist and starts feeling horribly inevitable. Mia's life, when we first really sit with it, feels like it's permanently stuck in the after her mother's death, after friendships shifted, after she quietly slid into the role of the extra person at Jade's dinner table rather than the daughter at her own. She's there in this in-between space, welcomed but not fully integrated, hovering at the edge of Jade's family scenes like someone who desperately wants to belong but doesn't quite know the rules. You can see it in the early domestic moments. Jade is snappy in that way only a teenager can be with a parent, but she still has a parent to push back against. Riley, her younger brother, gets to be the messy kid, the one who's allowed to be annoying and vulnerable at the same time. Mia, in contrast, is careful. She's helpful, polite, eager to please, always trying to read the room before she speaks. That imbalance, Jade and Riley taking their family for granted, Mia treating it like something fragile and borrowed, quietly sets up why she reaches so hard for anything that promises a more intense, less lonely feeling. The first hint of something darker creeping into this ordinary world isn't actually the hand. It's that roadside encounter with the injured kangaroo, which plays like a moral test. Mia fails in slow motion Joshi. She's confronted with a living thing in agony, and the kind option is obvious. Put it out of its misery. But she can't. She hesitates, wrestles with herself, and then drives away, leaving the animal to suffer because she's not ready to be the person who ends a life, even mercifully. That moment sinks into the background, but it becomes the emotional blueprint for the decision she'll face later. Only next time, the stakes are so much worse. From there, the film eases us into the social world where the supernatural will take root. We see the teenagers constantly on their phones, not just scrolling but recording, sharing, documenting every weird little moment of their lives. It's not that the internet caused the horror, it's that this always-on, always-performing atmosphere makes the horror feel like just another trend to jump on. When Mia and Jade hear about a game involving a severed hand that supposedly allows the dead to talk through you, it doesn't land like a campfire ghost story. It lands like an invitation to the wildest, most shareable experience in their social circle. The first party, where Mia encounters the hand, is almost disappointingly mundane in terms of setting. We're in a regular suburban house, cluttered with people and cheap booze, the kind of place where you'd expect nothing more dangerous than a hangover and some bad decisions. The hand itself looks strange, but not overtly terrifying, more like a prop, a dare object, something you'd see on a shelf in a novelty store if you didn't know better. There's no long explanation about where it came from, no priest, no dusty old book. All the rules we learn come from the kids themselves, passed along as if they're explaining how to play a drinking game. Hold the hand, say the words, let the spirit in, keep it under 90 seconds, and whatever happens, don't go over that time. What's striking is how casual everyone is about the risks. They've clearly done this before, and it's treated like a thrill ride, a controlled brush with something dangerous that's supposedly safe as long as you stick to the informal guidelines. People take turns, laugh, scream, and immediately replay the footage on their phones. Even when possessions look rough, with bodies jerking and voices changing, the mood in the room is more excited than alarmed. The horror becomes a spectacle, something to cheer for rather than something to fear, and that mindset is exactly what makes the coming catastrophe possible. Mia doesn't jump in immediately. She watches. She studies the others as they undergo possession, trying to understand what they're feeling and why it looks so intoxicating. When she finally volunteers, it's not just curiosity. It's a response to feeling left out, to being on the sidelines of her own life. Everyone else has a role. Jade's the slightly cynical friend, Riley's the kid who wants to prove himself, the other teens are the cool insiders who already know the game. Mia wants the experience that will make her feel like she's finally part of something, even if that something is potentially lethal. Her first possession is staged almost like a drug montage. She grips the hand, says the phrase, and the film shifts into a more heightened register, the way her eyes change, the sudden presence she's reacting to that no one else can see. The spirit that appears in front of her is grotesque, but the sequence isn't shot like a simple scare, it's shot like an overwhelming rush, a full-body transformation that leaves her gasping and laughing afterward, buzzing with adrenaline. The 90-second limit, shouted and monitored by her friends, functions like a dosage cap, another reason the addiction metaphor hits so hard. They know they're flirting with danger, but they also believe they're in control because there's a timer and a rule. What's even more important than the terror is Mia's reaction once it's over. She wants to go again, right away. There's a glow on her face, a looseness in her body language that we haven't seen before. It's the first time we've watched her look genuinely alive instead of weighed down. In that moment, the film makes it very clear. This isn't just about contacting the dead, it's about escaping the heaviness of being herself. From there, the party evolves into a montage of possessions, each one filmed and replayed as if they're curating a highlight reel of their own hauntings. Music blares, kids scream and howl with laughter, bodies thrash under the influence of whatever's come through the hand, and every time someone snaps out of it, the first impulse is to ask, "Did you get that on camera?" The line between genuine fear and entertainment blurs until it's almost non-existent. That escalation from cautious first experiment to gleeful repetition is how the film quietly transforms a supernatural risk into a normalized pastime. Act 1's real turning point comes when this game stops being something Mia does among peers and starts intruding on the relationships she cares about the most. She isn't satisfied with a single high. She wants to push, to explore, to chase whatever it is that grabbed hold of her. That restless hunger is exactly what sets up the disastrous decision involving Riley, when the hand is no longer just a party stunt but a way to connect, to impress, and to prove that the supernatural contact she felt wasn't just a trick of the light. By the time the first act closes, the film has taken us from a lonely girl and a roadkill test of mercy to a group of teenagers who treat possession like a trending challenge, and Mia is right at the center of it, already in too deep to recognize how bad things are about to get. Riley's big possession scene isn't just a horror centerpiece. It's the moment the film rips the safe illusion away and shows what all those earlier party games were leading to. Up to this point, Riley has been the kid brother on the sidelines, curious, a little insecure, eager to be taken seriously by Mia and Jade. He hangs around the older teens, soaks in their stories, and watches their videos of the hand with that mix of fear and fascination you only see in someone who desperately wants to be included. For him, the hand isn't primarily about grief or escape, it's about finally stepping into the same dangerous, exciting world the older kids inhabit. That difference in motivation is crucial because it's what Mia underestimates when she lets him step into the chair. The context of the night matters. The group has already normalized the ritual to the point that they're joking through it, timing each other with casual confidence, swapping stories about which spirits were funny and which ones were weird. Mia has had intensely vivid experiences and has come out the other side laughing, buzzing, wanting more. So when Riley timidly asks if he can try, the others hesitate for a moment, but it's not a serious moral hesitation. It's more like the half-hearted resistance you get when a younger sibling asks to join an adult game. The room isn't treating this like life or death. They're treating it like a roller coaster that might be too much for a kid but probably fine. Mia's decision to push for Riley to have a turn is one of the most devastating choices in the film. She knows what it feels like to be on the outside, to watch everyone else experience something ecstatic while you're stuck watching. So when she encourages Riley, insisting he'll be okay, promising they'll keep it short, it comes from a twisted place of empathy. She wants him to feel the same rush that finally made her feel alive. In her mind, she's doing him a favor, giving him a chance to escape the awkward younger brother role, to share in the secret thrill she's discovered. What she can't see, because she's already hooked, is that she's essentially handing her unresolved grief to a kid and asking him to hold it for her. The staging of Riley's possession is deliberately different from the earlier one. When he grips the hand and says the phrase, there's an almost immediate sense that something is wrong, even before things get graphic. The energy in the room shifts from rowdy to uneasy. The spirit that comes through him feels more focused, more malicious, more intimately tied to Mia's unresolved trauma than any of the previous entity. He starts speaking with knowledge he shouldn't have, referencing Mia's mother and details that hit her right in the center of her grief. In that instant, the game stops being a generic brush with the dead and turns into a direct line to the one person Mia can't let go of. This is where the addiction metaphor slams into the grief metaphor. Mia isn't just watching a possession, she's hearing, or at least believing she's hearing, her mother's voice using Riley's body as a conduit. The rules they set up, the 90-second cap, the strict timing, start to erode under the weight of that emotional pull. The others try to pull the plug on the session, but Mia begs for more time, desperate to prolong the contact, to get just a little more from this impossible reunion. Her need blinds her to the panic in the room and to the fact that Riley, physically and spiritually, is bearing the cost of her refusal to let go. Once they push past the supposed safety limit, the scene explodes into one of the most brutal sequences in the film. Riley's body becomes the battleground. His head slams into the table and the walls. His face is torn open, and it's immediately clear that whatever is inside him isn't just visiting anymore, it's trying to stay. The violence is shocking, not just because of the gore, but because of how young and fragile he is compared to the older teens we've seen play with the hand. Every impact feels like a direct consequence of their earlier arrogance, of the way they turned something incomprehensible into a party trick. Visually, the moment is chaotic and almost unbearable, which is exactly the point. The earlier possessions were intense but controlled, people were restrained, the timer was running, and everyone laughed once it was over. Here, restraint fails. Adults finally burst into the room, but they're too late to prevent the damage. For the first time, the film forces the characters and the audience to confront the reality that this ritual leaves more than emotional scars. It leaves broken bones, mutilated faces, and long-term trauma that no amount of phone footage can make cool. What lingers after the immediate horror is the fallout. Riley's near-death experience blows up every casual assumption the group held about their control. Jade is shattered, watching her younger brother suffer because of something she never fully believed was dangerous until it was too late. Their mother, Sue, is devastated and furious, and her rage doesn't fall on some distant evil. It lands squarely on Mia, the outsider who brought the horror into their home. In one night, Mia goes from semi-adopted member of the family to the person everyone associates with catastrophe. For Mia, the guilt is almost as destructive as the supernatural threat. She knows. She pushed Riley into the ritual. She knows she insisted on more time. And now, every time she looks at him in the hospital, broken and unresponsive, she sees the physical embodiment of her failure to make the right call. Just like with the kangaroo. Except this time, she didn't walk away. She pushed forward when she should have stopped. That twisted mirror between her inability to end suffering on the road and her role in causing suffering in this house is what chains her to the events that follow. The Riley scene is the story's point of no return because it changes the genre of the situation for the characters. Before, they were in a spooky thrill ride with scary but reversible consequences. Afterward, they're in a tragedy, stuck with a harm that can't be undone, only may be contained. From this point on, every choice Mia makes is colored by that one catastrophic night. Her visions, her desperation to fix what happened, and her growing willingness to believe that the spirits might offer a solution, even as they continue to manipulate her. After Riley's collapse, the film slows down and gets quieter. That quiet is worse than the screaming. Mia exists in a kind of suspended guilt. She visits the hospital, watches Riley lie unresponsive, and carries the weight of what she did with a specific quality of shame that has no clean outlet, because she can't fully explain what happened to the adults in the room without sounding like she's lost her mind. Sue, Jade's mother, makes it crystal clear that Mia is not welcome at her son's bedside. That scene, short as it is, hits like a door slamming on everything Mia had been borrowing to survive. The warmth of that house, the sense of family, the feeling of not being entirely alone. It all gets revoked at once. So now she has her actual home, her actual father, and a silence between them that neither one knows how to break. The film carefully shows us what Mia's home life looks like without softening it. Her father, Max, isn't villainous or abusive. He's just absent in the emotional sense, moving through the house the way two strangers might share a waiting room. He loved her mother too, and that shared loss should theoretically draw them together, but it's done the opposite. They orbit the same grief from completely different distances, unable to synchronize, unable to even start the conversation that might help either of them breathe. Mia's neediness, her desperate need for connection, for someone who knew and loved her mother the way she did, that hunger, is the opening the spirits have been waiting for. The visions start quietly, at the edges of her day. She sees her mother in a mirror, catches a glimpse of her at the end of a hospital corridor, hears something in the middle of the night that doesn't quite resolve into a sound she can name. The film is deliberate about not playing these as cheap jump scares. Instead, they're filmed with a kind of aching tenderness, almost like Mia is being gently beckoned rather than violently attacked. The spirits understand her. They've been inside her, literally. They know exactly which wound to press to get what they want. What they want, the film slowly reveals, isn't just to talk, it's to stay. The supernatural logic here is elegant in the most unsettling way. Mia used it multiple times in a short span, and she already has a pre-existing attachment to one specific spirit, or something pretending to be one. The entity that speaks in her mother's voice knows things. It says things that cut through Mia's defenses instantly, because they sound like things only her mother would know, would phrase, would feel. That's the manipulation engine at the heart of the film's second act. Grief as a security vulnerability, love as a master key. There's a particular hospital hallucination sequence that crystallizes this completely. Mia is sitting near Riley's bed. She sneaks in when Sue isn't there, and the room shifts. Her mother appears. Not shrieking, not grotesque in this moment, but present, warm, asking to be let in. The way the film shoots this, with soft lighting bleeding into something slightly wrong at the edges, makes Mia's reaction completely understandable even as you're watching it with dread. Because if you lost someone suddenly, and something sat across from you wearing their face and their voice and their specific way of saying your name, wouldn't some part of you reach back? Mia reaches back. And that decision accelerates everything. She starts using the hand alone, which breaks the one informal rule the group had operated under. The ritual was always a communal act, witnessed, timed, supervised in the loosest sense of the word. Mia strips all that away. She wants privacy for this. She wants time with whatever is pretending to be her mother without anyone clocking the seconds down or pulling her back before she's ready. That shift from communal ritual to private obsession is the exact inflection point where thrill-seeking ends and addiction fully takes over. She's not chasing a high anymore. She's chasing a person she lost, and that makes it categorically more dangerous. The toll on her body and mind becomes visible in a way the earlier possessions didn't produce. She's sleeping badly. Her concentration is fractured. She snaps at Daniel, who genuinely likes her and keeps trying to stay close despite the chaos she's trailing behind her. She isolates even further from Jade, who is consumed with Riley's condition and has no bandwidth left for whatever Mia is going through. The social world that brought Mia to the hand in the first place has essentially evaporated, leaving her with only the ritual and the promise of her mother's voice. What the film does brilliantly through this stretch is keep you genuinely uncertain about what Mia is experiencing. Is the entity actually her mother? Can the dead communicate through the hand? Or is this something else entirely, something predatory using a recognizable shape to lure her in? The film doesn't rush to answer that. Instead, it leans into the ambiguity in a way that makes Mia's suffering more complete, because she can't be certain either. She's chasing contact with someone she loved through a ritual she knows has already caused catastrophic damage based on faith that what she's feeling is real and not a manipulation. The horror of the middle act lives entirely in that uncertainty. The visions grow more invasive. They start appearing without the hand. Mia begins seeing things in her waking hours that the audience isn't always sure are there. shadows at the corner of the frame, faces in reflective surfaces, moments where the film's color temperature subtly shifts to signal that something wrong is leaking into the normal world. The Philippa brothers don't over-explain this either. There's no exposition scene where someone says, the longer you use the hand, the more the spirits can reach you. The audience pieces it together through Mia's deterioration, which is a far scarier form of storytelling because it means the rules are never fully knowable. The emotional core of this stretch is the relationship between Mia's grief and her culpability. She caused Riley's condition. She can't undo that, but the spirits, specifically the one wearing her mother's face, begin to offer her a path. They suggest, in the wordless way supernatural manipulation works in this film, that maybe she can fix it. That maybe if she goes deeper, stays longer, surrenders more completely, something on the other side can pull Riley back from wherever he's been taken. The logic doesn't hold up to scrutiny, but grief doesn't submit to scrutiny. Grief submits to need. And Mia's need is enormous. By the midpoint of the film, she has essentially reconstructed a new dependency on the ritual. Where her first dependency on it was social and thrill-based, this one is emotional and increasingly delusional. She believes in the possibility of reversing what she did. She holds onto the image of her mother like a life raft while simultaneously, and without realizing it, opening herself up to something that doesn't actually care whether she survives the process. This is the film working at its thematic best, because addiction, real addiction, not the metaphorical shorthand version, almost never announces itself as destruction. It announces itself as relief, as solution, as the one thing that works when everything else has failed. Mia's arc in the middle act is so painful to watch because she is genuinely trying to make something right, trying to love her way back to a version of things that works, using the only method that's ever given her any peace. That the method is destroying her is beside the point in her mind. The alternative is sitting with a grief she has no tools for, in a house that feels like a stranger's, waiting for something to change on its own. Nothing changes on its own in Talk to Me. Things only break further, or they get forced. The setup is almost complete. The film has built Mia's obsession to the point where the audience can feel the pressure building behind it, and now all it needs is one more push, one more act of desperation from a girl who's lost the ability to read the difference between real contact and calculated manipulation, before the whole thing collapses in a direction from which there is no returning. Talk to Me lives or dies on whether you believe in Mia, not just as a horror protagonist running from something dangerous, but as a fully recognizable human being making choices that are wrong in ways that make complete sense. Sophie Wilde carries almost every scene in this film, and what she does with Mia is the kind of performance that horror rarely gets credited for. Specific, layered, and emotionally continuous, even when the supernatural elements start pulling the narrative in wilder directions. Mia, the architecture of a girl coming apart. The most important thing to understand about Mia is that her brokenness predates the hand by a significant stretch. She enters the film already fractured, already orbiting the edges of other people's lives because the setter of hers, her mother, was taken suddenly, in circumstances the film holds back and then reveals with precision. She didn't get a proper goodbye. She didn't get closure. What she got instead was a story that didn't quite add up, and a father who retreated into his own grief so completely that the two of them stopped being a family and became two people sharing square footage. Sophie Wilde plays all of this without ever underlining it. There's no scene where Mia explicitly monologues about her pain. Instead, Wilde communicates it through posture, through the way Mia holds back in conversations, through the particular brand of performed confidence she wears at parties when she doesn't want anyone to know how much effort it takes to be there. Watch the scene where she's at Jade's dinner table early in the film. She laughs at the right moments, passes dishes helpfully, says all the things a good houseguest says, but Wilde's eyes are doing something slightly different, absorbing every piece of family warmth like someone who's running on reserve power and knows it. When Mia first grabs the hand, Wilde plays the discovery of possession with something that isn't quite fear and isn't quite exhilaration. It's closer to relief. That's the performance choice that makes everything that follows devastating, because it tells you from the first contact that Mia isn't playing a game. She's found something that makes the pain quiet down. The particular looseness in her body after her first possession, the way she laughs and reaches for her friends, is the first genuinely free moment we've seen for her, and it's built entirely on something that's about to destroy her. Her arc across the film is essentially the arc of someone who trades in one form of numbness for another, more dangerous one. She replaces the hollow grief with the electric intensity of possession, and then replaces that with the desperate need to hear her mother's voice again, and each substitution takes her further from the things that might actually help. What makes Mia tragic, rather than simply foolish, is that she's never wrong about her emotional need. She really does need connection, warmth, contact with someone who loved her. She's only wrong about the delivery system. The final stretches of the film demand the most from Wilde, as Mia operates on fumes of sanity, barely distinguishing her hallucinations from her waking life. There's a quality of absolute exhaustion in the performance by that point, not just physical tiredness, but the specific hollowness of someone who has been pushing against grief so hard for so long that she has no energy left for anything else. That Wilde makes this readable without making it melodramatic is a genuine achievement. Jade, the best friend who can't carry everything. Jade is the kind of character who could easily become a functional sidekick, present primarily to worry about the protagonist and react to horror. Miranda Otto plays her with enough specificity to prevent that, and the script gives her enough autonomous pain to work with. She isn't just Mia's anchor. She's her own person navigating a crisis that started at her house, inside her family, because she didn't say no firmly enough when the hand first arrived. That guilt structure is interesting because it mirrors Mia's, but sits in a completely different emotional register. Mia carries her responsibility like fuel. It drives her forward into increasingly reckless attempts to fix things. Jade carries hers like weight. It pulls her inward, makes her cooler and more guarded, pushes her to protect what's left of her family by drawing a clean boundary around Mia. The moment when Jade essentially breaks with Mia isn't played as a dramatic betrayal, it's played as exhaustion. She simply can't hold both things anymore, her injured brother and the person who put him there. Their friendship, before everything collapses, is sketched with a naturalistic warmth that makes the fracture genuinely sad. They have the shorthand of people who've known each other through multiple phases of life, the kind of rhythm in conversation that you can only build over years. When that rhythm disappears, replaced by formal politeness and then outright conflict, the loss of it registers as a specific grief layered on top of all the other griefs in the film. Jade losing Mia and Mia losing Jade happens simultaneously and for almost entirely mutual reasons, which is more honest than most films bother to be about how friendships actually break. Riley, innocence, used as a lever. Riley is the film's moral heart, which is a strange thing to say about a character who spends most of the third act either hospitalized or wrong in a way that's hard to articulate. But his function in the story isn't as a tragic victim in the passive sense. He's the character through whom the film measures everyone else's responsibility. Joe Bird's performance gives Riley a very specific kind of adolescent transparency. Everything he feels shows up on his face without the armor teenagers develop later. The practiced cool, the performed indifference. When he wants to be taken seriously by the older teens, you can see how much that need costs him to show. When he's frightened during his possession but doesn't want to admit it, the effort of concealment is visible in every muscle. That vulnerability is what makes his injury so devastating rather than just shocking, because the audience has already registered that this is genuinely a kid, not just a supporting cast body in the path of the horror. Post-possession, when Riley is apparently still inhabited or influenced by something that came through the hand, the film uses him in a different and more unsettling way. The blankness, the occasional wrong frequency smile, the moments when he says something that sounds like Riley but lands with the cadence of something else, all of this creates a particular dread because you're watching someone who was warm and present be replaced by a hollowness that wears his face. The horror of losing Riley isn't that he's dead, it's that something is still occupying the space he left. Sue! The real-world consequence, personified Sue, played with tight, barely controlled fury, represents something the horror genre usually sidelines, the adult reality of what teen recklessness produces. She isn't a villain. She isn't an obstacle. She's a mother whose child was catastrophically harmed, and her refusal to offer Mia grace or sympathy is not monstrous. It's completely rational. The film is smart enough to let Sue be right. Mia did bring the ritual into her home, did push Riley into participating, did beg for more time when she should have been protecting him. Sue's anger doesn't require softening for the audience to stay with Mia, because the film holds both truths at the same time. Mia is grieving and complicated and deserving of empathy, and she also caused real harm to a real child, and the person who raised that child gets to be furious. Horror films often rush to reintegrate their protagonists into a community of support. Talk to Me lets the rupture stay rupture. Her maternal presence also functions as a painful contrast to Mia's own motherlessness. Every time Sue erupts into protective rage over Riley, every time she sits by his hospital bed, every time she rebuilds the perimeter of her family against whatever threatens it, Mia is watching someone do for their child what nobody was left to do for her. That contrast doesn't need to be spoken. It sits in the background of every interaction between them, adding another layer to why Mia chases her mother's voice so desperately. Daniel, the boy who keeps showing up, Daniel is perhaps the character most likely to be overlooked on a single viewing, but he's doing something essential. He represents the road Mia doesn't take, connection through actual presence rather than supernatural substitution. He likes her, shows up for her, tries to be the person who holds her steady even as she spirals, and doesn't have the emotional vocabulary or the access to reach her where she's gone. His helplessness in the face of her obsession is one of the film's quieter tragedies. He's doing everything a supportive person can do. Checking in, showing concern, trying to keep lines of communication open, and it doesn't matter at all because what Mia needs isn't the living person offering patience. She needs something only the dead, or something pretending to be the dead, can give her. Daniel's presence in the second and third acts functions almost as a rebuke to the supernatural manipulation. Here is a real human who cares about you, and she can't feel it because the ritual has recalibrated what feeling means for her. The ensemble as pressure system. What all 5 of these characters share is that they're all operating under different qualities of loss and pressure, and the hand is the point where those pressures intersect destructively. Jade's guilt, Riley's desire for belonging, Sue's maternal protective fury, Daniel's unrequited care, Mia's bottomless grief. None of these exist in isolation, and none of them would have produced a catastrophe on their own. It's the specific combination, the way they were all in the same space with the same object at the same time, that produces the damage the film traces. That's the thing about Talk to Me that separates it from straightforward supernatural horror. The evil isn't external. The hand exists, yes, and the spirits are real within the film's logic, but the catastrophe wasn't caused by an ancient curse reaching out and grabbing teenagers. It was caused by a group of specific people with specific wounds, all choosing, at the same moment, to look away from the responsible option. The supernatural just walked through the door, those choices left open. Before we get into specific shots and sequences, it's worth pausing on the fact that Danny and Michael Filippo came from YouTube, not film school, not an industry apprenticeship program. They built their directorial instincts making short-form content for an online audience trained to lose interest in seconds. And if you pay close attention to how Talk to Me is put together, that origin isn't a footnote. It's actually visible in the filmmaking. The pacing, the attention to how quickly a scene needs to establish stakes, the awareness that the camera has to be doing something interesting at every moment, or the audience drifts, all of that feels like it was shaped by years of understanding exactly how attention works. Direction. Restraint as the primary weapon. The most consistent directorial choice in Talk to Me is knowing what not to show and when. The Philipper brothers make a decision early and stick with it. The spirits themselves are never fully explained, never given mythology dumps, never shown in a way that makes them comprehensible. What the audience sees during possessions is always filtered through reactions. The possessed person's face and body, the horrified or thrilled expressions of the people watching, rather than the entity itself. The thing that's entered the body becomes more terrifying precisely because the film refuses to let you get a clear look at it. Your imagination, shaped by the specific qualities of each performer's physical reaction, fills in the blank with something worse than any CGI monster the budget could have produced. This restraint extends to how the film handles the supernatural escalation. A lesser horror film would steadily increase the explicitness of its monsters as the stakes rise, showing more and more in an attempt to generate bigger reaction. Talk to Me inverts that logic. The most terrifying sequences aren't the ones where the camera gets closest to the entity. They're the ones where the camera gets closest to the human face bearing the cost of contact. When Riley is possessed, the camera stays on his features, his expression cycling through fear and wrongness and pain, while the entity speaks through him. The effect is claustrophobic and intimate in a way that pure creature horror can't manufacture. The brothers also make a pointed stylistic choice about the film's normal moments. The first 2 acts are shot with a visual energy that deliberately resembles the kind of footage you'd see on a teenager's social media. Handheld, immediate, slightly rough around the edges, embedded in the chaos of parties and bedrooms and kitchen conversations. This isn't accidental messiness. It's a strategy to make the supernatural intrusions feel like violations of a familiar visual world. When the horror arrives, it doesn't feel like a genre shift. It feels like something wrong has entered your own living room footage. Cinematography, the grammar of dread. Cinematographer Sjeljko Ulrich does something in this film that takes a few scenes to fully register. He treats light as a moral indicator. The domestic spaces in Talk to Me, the warm kitchen scenes at Jade's house, the bright, ordinary bathroom where Riley gets ready before the party, are lit with the kind of flat, slightly overexposed naturalism of actual teenage photography. Nothing is dramatically shadowed or artificially moody. That ordinariness is load-bearing, because when the supernatural starts bleeding through, the light doesn't immediately go dark and cinematic in the way genre conventions might lead you to expect. Instead, it goes slightly wrong, Highlights creep too far. Shadows accumulate in places that don't quite match the apparent light source. The frame looks almost normal, but the almost is doing enormous work. The hand itself gets a very specific visual treatment every time it appears. Ulrich shoots it with a close attention to its texture. The ceramic, the fused fingers, the discoloration, that sits somewhere between documentary observation and fetishistic fixation. The camera lingers on it the same way Mia's eyes linger on it, with a pull that's less frightening than it is magnetic. You understand, through the camera's relationship with the hand, why the teenagers keep reaching for it. It's shot as something genuinely compelling, something that has a presence before it ever does anything overtly threatening. There's a sequence during one of Mia's solo possession attempts where the cinematography shifts into something genuinely hallucinatory. The frame tilts slightly, whites bloom at the edges, and the physical space of the room seems to flex very subtly, not a dramatic special effects distortion, but something just a few degrees off from visual normal. The effect suggests that the boundary between Mia's perception and reality is thinning from repeated exposure, without ever spelling that out in words. That's cinematography carrying story information, which is what separates competent technical work from genuinely expressive filmmaking. The hospital scenes are shot in a noticeably cooler register, institutional whites and blues replacing the warmer suburban palette. And this isn't just visual variety for its own sake. The hospital is where consequences live. It's the place where the hand's damage has been made permanent and undeniable, and the color shift signals that emotionally before the characters say a word about how wrong things have become. Sound design, the most underrated element in the film. If the cinematography is Talk to Me's nervous system, the sound design is its central nervous system, and it deserves far more attention than it typically gets in reviews. The possession sequences have a specific, layered sound architecture. When a spirit enters someone's body, the audio doesn't simply get louder or more dissonant in the conventional horror way. It gets denser. There are voices under the voices, breathing that doesn't match the body's visible respiration, a low-frequency rumble that you feel more in your chest than you hear with your ears. The effect is that possession doesn't just look like an invasion. It sounds like one, like a signal being overlaid on a transmission that was already running, distorting everything. The hand's presence in any scene is accompanied by a very subtle audio signature, a faint, almost subsonic resonance that registers on the edge of perception. Most audiences probably couldn't consciously identify it, but it functions as a physiological cue, a small trigger of unease that primes the body before anything visual happens. The sound design is doing anticipatory emotional work, essentially programming the audience's nervous system to associate the hand's proximity with low-level dread before the scares arrive. The decision to contrast this with very naturalistic, unscored ambient sound in the film's safe sequences is equally deliberate. Jade's house sounds like an actual family home. Cutlery on plates, a television in another room, a car in the driveway. These sounds are deliberately mundane, and their presence makes the absence of that normalcy feel significant when it drops away. When the sonic landscape of a scene goes quiet in a particular way, the audience has already been conditioned to understand that as a warning signal. The voices that emerge during possession, when spirits speak through the teenagers' bodies, are processed with restraint. They don't shift into extreme demonic territory, the kind of pitched-down, saturated texture that signals Hollywood evil. Instead, they're subtly wrong, pacing slightly off, register slightly mismatched to the body, intonation landing at strange angles. The effect is uncanny rather than cartoonishly menacing, which is far more effective because uncanny sits in an unresolvable space. You can't fully dismiss it, and you can't fully accept it as anything coherent. The most devastating use of sound in the film is the way Mia's mother's voice is delivered when it comes through the hand. It doesn't sound monstrous. It sounds like a specific real person. The warmth in it is the cruelest technical choice in the movie, because you understand immediately why Mia can't just shut it out. Whatever is doing the impersonation is doing it well enough that the audience, just briefly, almost believes it too. Almost. Editing. The rhythm that makes the ritual feel real. The editing of Talk to Me, handled by Jeff Lamb, performs a very specific structural function. The first act of the film is edited at a rhythm that mirrors the hand ritual itself, a buildup of ordinary party footage, a heightening of anticipation, then the sharp impact of possession, and then an exhale as it ends, and everyone recovers. By repeating this rhythm several times in quick succession, the editing essentially trains the audience in the ritual's pace before the film starts breaking. When the Riley sequence arrives and that rhythm is disrupted, when the 90-second beat doesn't produce the expected exhale, but instead escalates further and further without resolution, the violation registers as genuinely alarming, partly because of the editing's earlier conditioning. The audience has been taught when the scene should end. When it doesn't, The wrongness is felt structurally, not just visually. Later, in Mia's deteriorating second-act sequences, the editing starts eroding the boundaries between real scenes and hallucinatory ones. Cuts that should produce clean spatial and temporal clarity instead leave the audience slightly disoriented, uncertain whether a scene transition was real or mental, whether a presence in the frame was actually there. The editing is essentially modeling Mia's psychological state in the cut itself, making the audience's confusion structurally equivalent to hers. That is an editorial choice of genuine intelligence, and it's one of the reasons the film's final act lands with such disorienting force. The party possession sequences are also edited with a studied awareness of how viral content is actually assembled. There's a rhythm of close-up, wide, quick-cut, reaction, close-up again that mirrors the way highlight reel footage gets cut on social media. The implicit argument is that the ritual has been aestheticized, made consumption-friendly, formatted for distribution. And the editing implicates the audience in that process, because we're watching it with the same hungry attention we might give a particularly extreme viral clip. The hand, visual object is moral center. It would be easy to underrate the prop itself. The hand is the heart of the film's entire visual and thematic vocabulary, and the decisions about how it looks, how it's handled, and how the camera treats it are among the most important craft choices in the movie. It's cast in pale ceramic with a surface texture that reads simultaneously as organic and manufactured. Not quite skin, not quite stone, suggesting something that was once alive but has been preserved into a new, permanent form. The fused fingers give it an almost sculptural quality, like a gesture frozen mid-intention. It doesn't look like a Halloween prop or a fantasy artifact. It looks like something a serious, possibly disturbed person actually made from an actual human hand. And that specific quality of handmade wrongness is what gives it such sustained unease. The rituals of holding it, the specific grip, the saying of the words, the physical surrender into the chair, are choreographed with a consistency that makes them feel genuinely ceremonial over time. The film never explains the origin of these behaviors, which means they accrete gravity through repetition rather than mythology. By the third or fourth time, you've seen someone grip the hand and say the phrase, "Your body has learned to anticipate the consequences." The ritual has become real within the film's grammar, and the hand is the physical anchor of that reality. What the Philippou brothers and their creative team built here is a horror film that earns its scares through accumulation rather than shock. Every technical element, the direction's restraint, the cinematography's moral light, the sound design's layered dread, the editing's structural conditioning, the props' specific wrongness, feeds into the same larger project, making an audience genuinely feel the weight of a world where the dead stay close and grief is the door they walk through. There's a version of Talk to Me that functions as a clean supernatural horror film about a cursed hand and the teenagers who misuse it. That version exists, and it works on that level alone. But the film is constructed in a way that makes you feel the pull of something larger underneath the scares, a set of interlocking ideas about grief, compulsion, performance, and the specific ways young people in the digital age relate to pain. None of these themes are delivered in speeches or symbolism that requires a film studies degree to decode. They're embedded in behavior, in choices, in the specific textures of how characters treat each other and themselves. That's why they hit so hard. Grief is a distorted survival strategy. The film's central argument, the one that everything else orbits, is that grief without an outlet doesn't disappear. It transforms. It finds a shape that fits the available containers, and if those containers are unhealthy, the grief becomes something almost unrecognizable. Not just sadness anymore, but compulsion, delusion, self-destruction dressed up as connection. Mia never got to grieve her mother properly. The circumstances of her mother's death, implied throughout the film and eventually clarified with a precision that makes everything retrospectively worse, carry the specific cruelty of a loss that might have been preventable, which means guilt got fused into the grief from the very beginning. She wasn't just left behind. She was left behind with a question she can't answer, a story about what happened that doesn't fully add up, and a father who disappeared into his own version of the same wound. There was no ritual of mourning, no ceremony where the community gathered around her and said, "This loss is real, we see it, you're allowed to fall apart." What the hand offers, in the most fundamental sense, is a ritual. A structured, repeatable act, with a beginning and an end. A community of participants, a physical object that serves as an anchor, and the promise of contact with the dead. If you stripped out the supernatural horror and looked only at those structural elements, what Mia is seeking from the ritual is almost exactly what grief counselors describe when they talk about what grieving people need most: ceremony, witness, community, and some form of continued connection to what was lost. The tragedy isn't that she's looking for the wrong things. It's that she found the right things packaged inside something predatory. This is what separates Talk to Me from the majority of supernatural horror films that use grief as a backstory rather than a theme. Mia's vulnerability isn't a character flaw to be overcome. It's a natural human response to a devastating and unprocessed loss. The film doesn't position her grief as weakness. It positions it as the entirely understandable condition that bad forces exploit when society fails to provide adequate containers for it. Addiction, not a metaphor, an argument. The addiction parallel in Talk to Me is so precise and so consistent that it stops functioning as metaphor and starts functioning as structural argument. The film isn't saying the hand ritual is like addiction. It's saying it follows the same neurological and behavioral logic, and that the same cultural conditions that make substance abuse epidemic among young people make this particular form of supernatural self-destruction equally inevitable. Consider the escalation pattern. First use, experimental, social, driven by curiosity and peer pressure. First high, overwhelming, producing a sensation unlike anything previously experienced. Immediate craving for a second use. Gradual increase in frequency. Shift from social use to solo use. Tolerance development. Each session needs to go a little further, last a little longer, reach a little deeper to produce the same effect. Withdrawal symptoms. When the ritual isn't available, anxiety, restlessness, hallucinations bleeding into ordinary life. Harm to relationships, harm to the body, harm to others in the orbit of the user. Denial that any of this constitutes a problem. Every single step of that progression appears in the film, in order, applied to Mia's relationship with the hand. The Philippou brothers clearly knew what they were doing, because the script doesn't just include these elements, it times them to mirror the actual pacing of addiction narratives with an almost clinical fidelity. The moment when Mia uses the hand alone for the first time is explicitly coded as a turning point, staged with the same emotional texture as a scene in a drug film, where the protagonist shoots up in private for the first time, relief, shame, hunger, all tangled together in a way she doesn't have language for. What the film adds to this framework that most addiction narratives don't is the question of what fills the space that the substance is medicating. Mia isn't using the hand because she's bored or because she wants a thrill. She's using it because it is the only available treatment for an unbearable, untreated pain. And the film asks, without quite framing it as a question, what would have needed to be different, earlier, for her to have found a less destructive container for that pain? Better support systems at home? A community that normalized emotional expression? A cultural permission structure where a grieving teenager could fall apart and be held rather than expected to continue functioning? The addiction doesn't emerge from individual moral failure. It emerges from a specific environment that produced a specific wound and then left that wound unattended. Social media. The film never explicitly moralizes about phones or filming or online culture. It simply shows, with unflinching naturalism, how the logic of performance and documentation changes the way teenagers relate to their own experiences, including experiences that should be terrifying rather than shareable. The specific horror the film identifies isn't that social media makes people shallow or stupid. It's that social media creates a structural incentive to perform extremity. When the baseline currency of your social world is attention, and the fastest way to generate attention is to do something unusual, frightening, or transgressive and document it, then a ritual that involves apparent demonic possession isn't just dangerous, it's strategically appealing. It's content. The more intense the reaction, the more compelling the footage. The more compelling the footage, the more you get to exist visibly in your social world. The kids filming possession sequences aren't doing it despite caring about their friends. They're doing it precisely within the logic of friendship as it currently operates in their world, where sharing experiences means documenting them, where support sometimes looks like amplification rather than protection. When something goes wrong and they're still holding their phones up, it isn't purely callousness. It's a kind of confused loyalty to a set of norms that never anticipated this specific situation. What the film quietly indicts is the way this documentation culture creates a buffer between experience and consequence. When you're watching someone's possession through a phone screen, the frame provides a layer of distance that a raw, unmediated experience wouldn't. The screen makes it slightly unreal, slightly content, rather than purely crisis. That tiny perceptual shift is enough to delay the moment when someone puts their phone down and responds to what's happening as a human emergency rather than a compelling recording. By the time that moment arrives with Riley, the damage has already been done. The ending, a moral reckoning, disguised as horror resolution, functions in recent horror. It functions simultaneously as a logical extension of everything the film has argued, a devastating callback to its opening scene, and a refusal to offer the comfort of redemption that audiences often expect. Without retreading the specifics of the final sequence, the ending places Mia in the same structural position as the injured kangaroo on the road in the film's first act. She has a living thing and suffering in front of her, and she has to decide whether she can be the person who ends that suffering, or whether she'll do what she did before, which is flinch from the hard choice and let the pain continue. This time, she makes a different choice, or seems to, but the film doesn't reward that choice with survival or peace. The final frames of Talk to Me are among the most genuinely bleak in recent mainstream horror, not because Mia fails, but because the world the film has built doesn't have a mechanism for rewarding correct choices retroactively. She spent the entire film making decisions too late, going too far, staying too long, and the consequences of those choices don't reverse because she finally gets one right. That's not nihilism for its own sake. That's a film that takes its emotional logic seriously enough to follow it to its conclusion. What the ending actually says, if you sit with it, is something quite specific about grief's relationship to action. The kangaroo callback isn't just a neat structural symmetry, it's the film's thesis made physical. Mia's flaw throughout was not cruelty or selfishness, but an inability to accept irreversible loss and act accordingly. She kept trying to undo what couldn't be undone, to reach back into the past through a supernatural channel, to reopen an ending that had already been written. The ending asks whether accepting a terrible, unalterable loss and making the right choice in response to it is possible even when it's too late to change any outcomes. The answer Talk to Me gives is genuinely complex. Yes, that acceptance is possible, and it's still not enough to save you. The limbo question, what the afterlife actually represents, the film's vision of limbo, glimpsed in Mia's visions of what lies beyond the hand's portal, deserves attention as a theological and psychological choice rather than just a set design decision. The afterlife in Talk to Me doesn't look like peace or punishment. It looks like a muted, washed-out version of the world the characters already inhabit, recognizable enough to feel cruel, stripped of warmth and specificity. The spirits who come through the hand aren't fully conscious, autonomous beings with coherent desires. They behave more like recordings playing at the wrong speed, fragments of personality organized around whatever emotional content they carry, driven by something closer to compulsion than intention. The implication is devastating. The dead aren't free. They're stuck in a version of the same loops they were running in life, drawn back to the living, not out of love, but out of the same kind of need that drives the living to reach toward them. Both sides of the hand are haunted. The ghosts want to feel something. Mia wants to feel something. The hand exists at the intersection of those two identical hungers, and the only thing it actually produces is more need, more loss, more damage flowing in both directions. That's Talk to Me's final, most unsettling argument, that grief, when it becomes obsession, doesn't honor the dead. It traps them in the same amber that's trapping the living. The way to love someone you've lost isn't to chase their voice through supernatural channels and hold on past the limit. It's to let go cleanly enough that whatever remains of them can exist without being endlessly summoned back into pain. Mia never fully learns that, and the film doesn't pretend otherwise. Talk to Me arrived at Sundance 2023 and did something that genuinely surprised people. It made a room full of film industry professionals and critics physically react. Not politely engaged, not intellectually appreciative, actually squirming, gasping, covering their eyes. For a debut feature from two Australian YouTubers working with a modest budget, that response was the beginning of something significant, and what followed proved it wasn't a fluke. Immediate impact, numbers, and reception. The film earned a near-perfect critical reception, landing in the mid-90s on aggregator scores and sustaining that across the full span of its theatrical run in ways that debut horror films rarely manage. Critics who typically resist the genre engaged with it seriously, and the conversation it generated wasn't primarily about the scares, it was about what it meant, which is the highest compliment a horror film can receive. It grossed roughly 4 times its production budget at the international box office, performing particularly strongly in markets where theatrical horror attendance had been sluggish in the post-pandemic years. For A24, which had already established itself as the home of elevated, character-driven horror, Talk to Me reinforced a brand identity, while also demonstrating that the studio could successfully develop talent from outside traditional industry pipelines. The awards circuit acknowledged it in the ways that matter at the craft level, recognition for performance, sound, and technical achievement categories, though the kind of major awards attention that films like Hereditary and Midsummer also narrowly missed continued to elude this particular corner of A24's catalog. That gap between critical reverence and institutional awards recognition is itself revealing. The Academy and similar bodies still struggle with horror that is genuinely, uncomfortably effective, as if the discomfort of watching it disqualifies the craft that produced it. What it changed for Australian horror. One of the film's most significant cultural contributions is almost entirely separate from its supernatural content. Talk to Me demonstrated on a global stage that Australian filmmaking can exist in the international horror conversation not as a novelty, but as a genuine creative force. Australian horror has a long and underappreciated tradition, from the stark outback dread of Wolf Creek to the psychological unease of the Babadook, which was itself a turning point in how international audiences thought about the genre from that part of the world. Talk to Me sits in that lineage, but occupies a different register. It's suburban, digitally native, and generationally specific to a way that feels immediately global rather than distinctly local. The accents and geography are Australian, but the emotional world, teenagers with phones, parents who don't fully see their kids, grief that gets no ceremony, reads as universally recognizable. That combination of local specificity and global emotional resonance is the signature of art that travels, and it traveled far. For younger Australian filmmakers, the Philippou brothers' trajectory carries a particular charge. They built an audience on YouTube before they built one in cinemas, which means the conventional gatekeeping structure of the industry. The training programs, the industry connections, the slow climb through shorts and TV wasn't the path. That precedent matters. It suggests that the path to a major studio horror debut can run through raw creative output and audience development in ways the industry is still figuring out how to process. What it contributed to horror as a genre. The most lasting craft contribution Talk to Me makes to horror is arguably its treatment of the possession subgenre. Possession films have existed since at least The Exorcist, and in the decades since, the visual vocabulary of possession has calcified into a set of familiar gestures, the voice dropping low, the eyes rolling back, the body contorting in ways human anatomy shouldn't permit. These images still work, but they work because they're familiar, because audiences have been conditioned to them rather than because they're inherently disturbing. What the Philippou brothers do is locate possession not in the body's extremes, but in the face's subtleties, in the wrong smile, the off-tempo blink, the voice that's almost right but lands at the wrong pitch. By making possession primarily an uncanny performance problem rather than a special effects showcase, they return the subgenre to the territory where it's most effective, the space where you can't quite tell if something is wrong, which is always scarier than the space where you definitely can. The restraint in how spirits manifest through possessed bodies in this film is going to influence how directors approach this material for years, in the same way that Hereditary's controlled atmosphere influenced a generation of horror directors after 2018. The film also contributed meaningfully to what might be called the social horror subgenre, films that take an existing social phenomenon and find the supernatural horror hiding inside it without reducing the social observation to allegory. Get Out used racism. Midsommar used codependency. Talk to Me uses the specific cocktail of grief, addiction, and social media performance that defines a particular experience of being young in the 2020s. The most effective horror films of this era all share that quality of making you feel that the supernatural element isn't imported from outside the human experience, but extracted from it, pulled out of something already present in the way people live and treat each other. Why it endures. Beyond the first watch, the films that earn lasting reputations in horror tend to be the ones that change slightly on a second viewing, where knowing the outcome reframes the early scenes and reveals a layer of craft that the first watch terror obscured. Talk to Me rewards rewatching in exactly this way. The kangaroo scene, experienced fresh, feels like a character moment and a slight tonal curiosity. Watched again, knowing where the film ends, it's the entire moral architecture of the story compressed into 90 seconds. Every scene with Riley before his possession, watched with the outcome in mind, carries a specific weight. The awareness of his transparency, his need to belong, his willingness to trust Mia in a way that she didn't earn yet. The domestic warmth of Jade's family home, experienced the second time, is actively painful, because you know exactly what that warmth costs Mia and what she's about to destroy and trying to hold on to it. There's also a rewatchability to Sophie Wilde's performance that only becomes fully visible on a second pass. The small choices she makes in Mia's early scenes, the way she manages attention, the calibrated social performance of a girl who's learned to hide damage under pleasantness, are visible as deliberate construction once you know the full emotional blueprint. First time through, you receive her as a protagonist. Second time, you see the architecture of a specific kind of survivor, and you understand exactly which structural support got knocked out when her mother died. The question the film leaves open. Here's the thing about Talk to Me that no amount of analysis fully resolves. The film is genuinely ambiguous about whether what Mia contacts is her mother or something that only ever wore her mother's shape. That ambiguity isn't a storytelling gap. It's the film's most honest acknowledgement of the actual experience of grief. Because in real grief, that question doesn't resolve either. You don't know, and can't know, whether the presence you feel when you're missing someone is their actual continued existence in some form, or the echo of them that lives in your own mind, organized by love into a shape that behaves the way they would have. Both possibilities are comforting, both are painful, and both lead to the same experience of reaching for someone who isn't fully there and finding something that responds, but not quite in the way you needed. The hand, in its deepest function, is a physical metaphor for that experience. It's the human impulse to find a container for loss, to create a ritual that makes contact feel possible, to hold something solid when the thing you're reaching for has no physical form. The horror of the film isn't that teenagers found a supernatural object and used it unwisely. The horror is that what they were looking for, what Mia specifically was looking for, is something every grieving person looks for, and there is no safe version of it, and the world mostly doesn't help you find one. That kangaroo is still on the road somewhere in the film's imagination, still suffering, still waiting for someone to be brave enough to do the hard, kind, irrevocable thing. Mia finally was. Just not soon enough, and not for herself. What Talk to Me ultimately leaves you with isn't the image of the hand or the scares or even the ending's specific bleakness. It leaves you with the understanding that grief without witness becomes something dangerous, not because grief itself is the enemy, but because humans weren't built to carry it alone. The film's most terrifying suggestion isn't supernatural. It's entirely mundane, that if we don't build better ways of sitting with each other in pain, something will offer to do it for us, and it won't let go. Here's the extended bonus segment, approximately 4,200 words covering the Philippou brothers' origin story, Talk to Me's place in the grief horror canon, its supernatural mythology in depth, a comparative analysis with its contemporaries, and what the sequel means for the story's unfinished moral business. Bonus segment, deeper context, origins, canon, mythology, and what comes next. The YouTube pipeline, where Danny and Michael actually came from. To understand what makes Talk to Me feel different from most horror debuts, you have to spend some time with where the Philippou brothers were before they made it, because that context shapes virtually every instinct visible in the finished film. Danny and Michael Philippou ran a YouTube channel called Raka Raka, which, at its peak, had accumulated millions of subscribers watching them produce increasingly elaborate, stunt-heavy, often darkly comedic short videos. These weren't polished brand productions or carefully scripted comedy sketches. They were chaotic, physically committed. Sometimes genuinely alarming pieces of content that demonstrated two things very clearly. The brothers had a natural understanding of how to hold an audience's attention across short bursts of intense visual content, and they were completely unafraid of putting their bodies, and the bodies of their collaborators, through genuinely uncomfortable things in service of a reaction. What Raka Raka gave them that film school couldn't is an understanding of threshold. When you've spent years learning exactly how much is enough, how long a joke can run before it stops being funny, how graphic something needs to be before it tips from entertaining to alienating, how quickly you need to establish stakes before a viewer clicks away. You develop a feel for pacing that's almost physiological rather than intellectual. That feel is all over Talk to Me. The film is remarkably precise about when to give the audience a breath and when to take it away, when to let a scene settle into something intimate, and when to shatter that intimacy with violence. Those are the instincts of people who spent years studying what makes attention hold and what makes it break. There's also something specific about Raka Raka's aesthetic that survived the transition to cinema. The channel existed in the same online ecosystem as the teenagers in Talk to Me, the world of likes and shares and comments, and the constant awareness of how something is going to play to an audience before you've even finished making it. The brothers didn't observe that world from the outside as a subject worth critiquing, they lived in it professionally. When the film depicts teenagers who've aestheticized danger and violence into content, the Philippous aren't doing anthropology. They're drawing on direct personal knowledge of how that mindset operates, what it produces, and what it costs the people inside it. The transition from YouTube to a feature-length A24 production was enabled by the Australian horror production company Causeway Films, run by Samantha Jennings and Christina Satan, the same team behind The Babadook. That connection is worth dwelling on, because Causeway's track record makes the specific risk of backing two YouTubers with no feature experience considerably more legible. They knew what elevated, emotionally intelligent Australian horror looked like. They also had a production infrastructure and international distribution relationship that could turn a tight budget into a globally distributed theatrical release. The Philippous brought the instincts, Causeway brought the architecture. What the brothers specifically brought to their first feature that most debut directors lack is an entirely unself-conscious relationship with genre. A lot of first-time directors who transition from short-form content into prestige-adjacent horror spend visible energy proving they're serious, proving they understand the intellectual weight of what they're doing, pulling back from the visceral pleasures of the genre in deference to the expectations of critics and festival programmers. The Philippines didn't do any of that. They leaned in completely into the gore, the scares, the physical extremity, and trusted that the emotional intelligence could coexist with genuine horror effectiveness rather than needing to be demonstrated in opposition to it. That confidence is rare, and it's a large part of why the film works as both a festival darling and a genuine crowd pleaser. Talk to me in the grief horror canon. Horror has been processing grief for as long as it has existed as a genre. But there's something specific about the wave of grief horror films that emerged in the 2010s and accelerated into the 2020s that sets Talk to Me's context. The Babadook in 2014 reconfigured the monster as a literalization of depression and unprocessed loss. A Monster Calls in 2016, technically more fantasy than horror, but sitting at the border, used a literal creature as a frame for a child, learning to articulate the unspeakable feelings around a parent's illness. Hereditary in 2018 turned family trauma into something almost cosmically inescapable, with grief manifesting as demonic inevitability. Relic in 2020 mapped dementia and generational loss onto literal physical decay and architectural horror. Midsummer, also 2019, began with a grief so acute and unaddressed that the protagonist's radical disorientation in the face of a cult felt almost logical. What all of these films share is a conviction that the most effective contemporary horror doesn't generate fear by importing danger from outside the human psyche. It extracts fear from what's already in there, already produced by ordinary human circumstances of loss and disconnection and failed attachment. The monster is already in the house. It grew there. The supernatural element is the shape that unprocessed emotional reality takes when it can no longer be contained by ordinary life. Talk to Me sits in this lineage but occupies a specific generational position within it that none of the earlier films fully claimed. Where Hereditary and Relic and The Babadook all primarily centered adult or parental grief, the grief of people who've had years to build emotional architecture that still fails under the specific weight of particular losses. Talk to Me centers adolescent grief with a specificity that makes it feel genuinely distinct. Mia doesn't have the emotional tools that adults develop, imperfect as those tools often are. She doesn't have the financial independence to make choices about her grief, the spatial independence to create or avoid the environments that trigger her, or the social permission to fall apart in ways that adults, even struggling ones, sometimes find available to them. She has a bedroom, a phone, and a best friend's house that doesn't fully belong to her. That specificity of adolescent vulnerability within the grief horror tradition is Talk to Me's genuine contribution to the canon. It's not just grief. It's grief at the age when you have the least resources and the least permission and the highest exposure to the particular social pressures that make numbing, escaping, or externalizing the pain feel like reasonable strategies. It's grief in the exact developmental window when identity is still forming, which means the loss doesn't just take a person, it takes a version of yourself that never got to finish forming around them. The supernatural mythology. What the hand actually is. The film is deliberately coy about the origins of the hand, and that reticence is a craft decision rather than a storytelling gap. But it's worth unpacking what the film does tell us and what it implies to understand the specific theology the story is operating within. What we know for certain, the hand was made from an actual human body part, or at least that's what the lore surrounding it holds. It was preserved somehow. The ceramic quality of its surface suggests a process beyond simple embalming, something that locked it into a more permanent, object-like state while apparently maintaining its function as a conduit. The ritual attached to it, the grip, the verbal invitation, the 90-second limit, appears to have been developed empirically by people who used it and discovered through trial and error where the safe boundaries were. There's no priest who created it, no ancient text that documents it, no institution responsible for its containment. It exists in the informal economy of teenage social sharing, passed around like a dangerous piece of equipment whose manual has been lost. The spirits that come through it are not the peacefully departed. This is crucial. The film never suggests that the ritual creates a clean line of communication with the dead as they actually are wherever they are. What comes through are entities that carry the emotional signatures of the dead, their voices, their gestures, their most intimate knowledge of the living, but behave with a consistent self-interest that the actual dead people presumably wouldn't have. They want to stay. They reach for the living. They exploit emotional vulnerabilities with a precision that feels less like love and more like predation, wearing love's clothes. The film's theology, if you can call it that, seems to posit something like a liminal zone between the living world and whatever lies beyond it, a space where remnants of personality and emotion persist in a form that's neither fully conscious nor fully dissipated, driven by compulsions that mirror but distort the person they came from. These entities remember what they knew. They can use what they remember, but the using of it serves their need to hold on, to feel the warmth of the living, to maintain a tether to a world that's moving on without them, not the need of the grieving person to receive genuine comfort or genuine contact. That asymmetry is the hand's deepest horror. Both parties in the transaction want something genuine. The grieving want connection with the lost. The spirits want connection with the living. The hand facilitates an exchange that looks like both parties getting what they want, while actually being a situation where the spirits take what they need at a cost entirely borne by the living. Every possession leaves the physical body more vulnerable, the spirit more entrenched, the boundary between the two worlds more permeable. The ritual doesn't bring the dead closer in any way that helps the living. It brings the dead closer in a way that helps the dead hold on. The 90-second rule, understood in this context, isn't arbitrary. It reflects an experiential discovery that the longer the contact is maintained, the harder it becomes to close the door that was open. The spirits don't need long to get what they came for. The warmth, the aliveness, the sensation of existing in a body again. But the longer they stay, the more of themselves they leave behind inside the host. Riley, after his extended possession, isn't simply traumatized. Something was deposited in him that didn't fully vacate when the ritual ended, and that remainder is what gives the post-possession. Riley, his off-frequency quality, his wrong tempo affect, his eyes that look out at the world with something watching from further back than his face. The film doesn't name this process because it doesn't need to. The naming would actually diminish it, would make it feel like a genre convention with a label rather than a logic that the story built from the ground up. What matters is that it's consistent, and that its consistency makes the events of the story feel like the inevitable consequence of specific choices rather than random supernatural violence. Comparative analysis. Talk to Me among its peers. It's instructed to place Talk to Me directly alongside the two films it's most frequently compared to, because the comparison reveals both what it shares with them and where it charts genuinely independent territory. Hereditary is the obvious reference point. Both films center a female protagonist processing a complicated relationship with a dead parent. Both use the supernatural as an externalization of psychological crisis. Both are distributed by A24 and carry the elevated horror tag that the studio has been instrumental in popularizing. Both end in places that refuse comfort, but the emotional registers are profoundly different. Hereditary operates at the scale of family as system, exploring how trauma is transmitted generationally, how family structures create containers for pathology that individual members can't escape without destroying the system entirely. Its horror is almost architectural. It builds and builds with the inevitability of a structure collapsing under load. It was designed from the beginning to carry. The supernatural element, when it fully arrives, feels less like an invasion and more like a revelation. This is what was always underneath. This is what the family was always moving toward. Talk to Me is smaller in scope and more intimate in its disaster. Where Hereditary is about a family being consumed by something vast, Talk to Me is about a girl making specific choices that compound on each other until the damage is irreversible. The supernatural isn't what was always underneath. It's an opportunistic element that finds a crack already in the structure and pushes. Remove the hand from Mia's story, and she's still in trouble. Her grief, her isolation, her absence of support are all present and dangerous without any supernatural amplification. The hand simply accelerates and externalizes a deterioration that was already in motion. That makes it feel more contingent than Hereditary, more preventable in retrospect, which is its own specific quality of horror. The comparison to The Babadook is different in kind. Jennifer Kent's film is perhaps the purest entry in the grief horror subgenre, so direct in its metaphorical architecture that you can almost translate every scene beat for beat into the psychological process it represents, which is simultaneously its power and its slight limitation. The Babadook knows what it means, and it wears that meaning close to the surface. Talk to Me is messier in the best sense. It's less allegory and more situation, a set of characters in a specific social and emotional context, making real choices with real consequences that happen to intersect with something supernatural. You can read it thematically with great reward, as the previous segment demonstrated, but the themes don't reduce the story. They coexist with it. Mia is never a symbol. She's always a person, and the film's insistence on her specificity is what allows it to operate as both horror and genuine character study without one mode overpowering the other. If there's a contemporary film that sits closest to Talk to Me in terms of approach and emotional register, it might actually be Bones and All. Not a horror film, strictly speaking, but another 2022-2023 piece about compulsion as both condition and metaphor, about a young person whose nature makes ordinary belonging impossible, about the specific loneliness of carrying something that can't be confessed and can't be controlled. Both films locate their horror in the gap between what their protagonists need and what the world can safely provide. The sequel, and what it means for the story. A sequel to Talk to Me was confirmed while the original was still in theaters, and the Philippou brothers' involvement in its development has been publicly discussed, which makes it worth thinking about what a continuation of this story actually requires and what it risks. The challenge is structural. Talk to Me ends at a place that is, by design, morally and narratively complete. The consequences of Mia's choices have been fully realized. The film's central question, whether grief-driven compulsion can be interrupted before it becomes catastrophic, has been answered, and answered in the darkest possible register. A sequel that continues Mia's story directly risks either walking back the implications of that ending or deepening a bleakness that's already fully inhabited. The more interesting possibility, which the Philippou brothers seem to be gesturing toward in interviews, is a sequel that uses the world and mythology of the Hand rather than the specific character arc of the original. The Hand exists beyond Mia. The ritual has been spreading. We see that in the original film, with the implication that multiple groups in multiple locations have encountered and used it. A sequel that follows a different set of people encountering the same object, with the added weight of knowing what happened to the last group who used it irresponsibly, could function as an expansion of the mythology rather than a repetition of the emotional territory. What would make that work is not simply moving the scares to a new location with new characters, but finding a different emotional wound to exploit. The Hand, as the mythology of the first film establishes, is effective precisely because it finds the specific vulnerability of the specific person holding it. Mia's vulnerability was grief and motherlessness. A different protagonist brings a different opening, and the genuine horror opportunity in sequel territory is to demonstrate that the Hand's manipulation isn't specific to one kind of loss. It's adaptable, opportunistic, capable of wearing whatever face a new set of wounds requires. The risk is the one all sequels face when the original's power came significantly from the freshness of its approach. The second time through, the rules are known. The Hand's capabilities aren't a mystery. The escalation pattern, the manipulation of grief, the way spirits exploit emotional vulnerabilities. Audiences who saw the first film arrive at the sequel with the entire playbook already in hand. The Philippous' task is to use that audience foreknowledge as a tool rather than fighting it, to construct scares and emotional beats that work differently when you already know the terrain. The best horror sequels, the ones that justify their existence, take audience familiarity and weaponize it, making you dread things you recognize from exactly the moment you recognize them. Whether that's achievable with this particular property is a genuinely open question, and it's the kind of question that makes the wait for the second film genuinely interesting rather than merely commercial. The generation the film actually made. There's a demographic specificity to Talk to Me's reception that doesn't get discussed enough. The film performed particularly strongly with audiences in their late teens and 20s, people for whom the social world depicted on screen wasn't a window into a foreign subculture but a recognizable version of their own environment. The phones, the party dynamics, the specific flavor of peer pressure that makes a dangerous ritual feel less dangerous because everyone is doing it and filming it. None of this required translation for those audiences. That specificity of recognition is part of why the film's horror landed so effectively with younger viewers. The scares in a film about ancient curses or isolated rural locations require audiences to imaginatively project themselves into situations they don't inhabit. Talk to Me doesn't ask for that effort. It asks instead for a much more uncomfortable kind of recognition, the acknowledgement that the conditions enabling the horror aren't distant or exotic but present and familiar. That you've been at a party like the ones in this film, that you've seen the filming of transgressive content for shares and likes, that you know the specific social pressure of not wanting to be the one person in the room who breaks the momentum by pointing out that something might be going too far. That recognition is discomforting in a way that purely escapist horror can never be, because it collapses the comfortable distance between the audience and the horror. You're not watching teenagers make choices in a world that operates by different rules than yours. You're watching teenagers make choices in a world that operates by the same rules as yours, and arriving at outcomes that make you wonder, quietly and uncomfortably, whether your world's rules are actually as safe as they feel. That's the film's most enduring cultural contribution, separate from craft or genre positioning or box office numbers. Talk to Me made a generation of young people feel seen by a horror film, not in the sentimental sense, but in the unsettling sense of having something they recognized about their own lives reflected back at them in the shape of a catastrophe. That kind of recognition doesn't fade quickly. It attaches to the film and makes it available to return to at different ages and stages, where it will almost certainly look different each time. The Hand as cultural artifact. In the months and years since the film's release, The Hand has taken on a life as a cultural object in ways that perfectly, almost uncomfortably, mirror what the film was about. Replicas have been made and sold. Fan communities have documented and cataloged every appearance of the prop in the film's promotional material and behind-the-scenes content, with the same exhaustive attention people give to real historical artifacts. The ritual phrases from the film, "Talk to me, I let you in," entered the vocabulary of horror fan discourse in ways that suggest they've crossed from movie dialogue into something more like cultural shorthand. None of this is unusual for a successful horror property. Fan communities around horror films have always created this kind of secondary artifact culture. What's specifically interesting in Talk to Me's case is that the Hand's function in real fan culture reproduces its function in the film. It's an object that people are drawn to, that they document and share and compete to own a piece of, that generates excitement out of proximity to something associated with death and transgression. The meta layer isn't subtle, and the Philippus have acknowledged it in interviews with the kind of dry amusement of people who made a film about the compulsion to engage with dangerous objects and then watched audiences compulsively engage with the object from their film. Horror has always been self-referential at some level, always aware of its own conditions of spectatorship and the complicated pleasure of choosing to be frightened. Talk to Me's post-release cultural life suggests it understood that reflexivity with unusual clarity from the beginning, and built a mythology robust enough to survive the film itself and keep operating in the world the film was commenting on. What you're left with. Really 4,000 words into this extended section, it's worth being honest about what the accumulated analysis of this film actually adds up to. Talk to Me is not a perfect film. There are moments where the scripting leans on coincidence slightly harder than the emotional logic requires. The mythology, deliberately withheld, occasionally leaves gaps that feel less like productive ambiguity and more like underdeveloped backstory. Some of the supporting characters in the party scenes function primarily as atmosphere, present without quite being people. These are real limitations, and acknowledging them doesn't diminish the film's achievements. It actually clarifies them, because the achievements persist despite those limitations in a way that genuine craft makes possible. What the Philippou brothers made in their first feature is a film that earns the word that gets thrown at horror far too casually: necessary. Not necessary in the sense that we couldn't have survived without it, but necessary in the sense that it said something about a specific moment in human experience, about grief and addiction and the performance of pain in digital spaces and the catastrophic possibilities that open up when young people have enormous access to transgression and almost no access to genuine emotional support. That needed to be said in exactly this form, at exactly this level of formal control, with exactly this much willingness to follow the emotional logic to its darkest conclusion. The Hand is still out there, within the film's mythology. It didn't get destroyed. It didn't get locked away in some institutional archive where no one can reach it. It's circulating, the way dangerous things circulate when there's no legitimate system for containing them. Pass between people who know its history and people who don't, finding new hands that are already reaching for something to hold on to. That's the final, most honest thing Talk to Me says about the world it depicts. The conditions that made The Hand dangerous in the first place are still there. The grief is still there. The insufficient support structures are still there. The social media incentive to perform and document rather than protect and witness is still there. The film ended. The conditions didn't. Which means The Hand will keep finding people who need what it offers, and they will keep reaching back.